I just want to start with the Sky News tortoise investigation, Westminster accounts into money in Westminster. Now, the SNP are calling for root and branch reform. Do you think the system needs it?
No, look, I think the thing that's come out of that to me is that all of this money that people get is declared, and it's all publicly available for people to see, and then members of Parliament have to account for, you know, where they take donations, where they earn income from outside. Then they have to, it's all publicly available. They have to be able to be transparent about, you know, what they've taken, what they've been doing for it, and that's how it works. And and ultimately, in our system, if voters don't like it, they can boot them out and get a new member of Parliament.
I guess, like, where everyone agrees is the need for transparency, and that more transparency has got to be a good thing. One proposal that, for example, Eric Pickles, the Conservative peer chair of the sort of watchdog on second jobs, has suggested is that every donation should perhaps be registered under someone's actual name, rather than a company that people may or may not know who's behind it. I mean, is that the kind of thing that could be looked into?
Well, look, I'm very happy if people want to look at some of the detail. I mean, I think it is important that people know if MPs do some outside work and that doesn't get in the way of doing their job as an MP. I think it's important that MPs know what their primary job is, which is to represent their constituents. But if they do something else, as long as people are clear about who's paying for it, you know, and what work they're doing, and we've obviously tightened the rules up, have been tightened up on that over recent years, then I think that's absolutely fine. And ultimately, it's for MPs' constituents to look at the job they do, look at the information that's declared, and make a decision at election time about whether they want to keep them.
And I guess the more information, the better.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, so, I mean, I think if we look at proposals like that, those are ultimately for Parliament rather than for government. But, you know, I think if people want to look at those and bring proposals forward, then obviously people will look at them in an appropriate way.
Let's talk strikes. Transport Secretary, of course, you've had a busy few months, shall we say. Now, Mick Whelan, the General Secretary of the Aslef Train Drivers Union, today said that the possibility of a deal that would, of course, avert strike action in the future was zero. What would you put it at?
Well, look, I'm not going to put a number on it, but I thought it was
You wouldn't put zero,
well,
though.
I thought it was a bit unfair because since I met Mick Whelan, I mean, he made a perfectly reasonable point when I met him, which is that his union hadn't been given an offer yet, and obviously you're not in a position to talk about it. So, I mean, actually, things have actually moved on. He's had an offer. He's in a position now where his union can sit down with the rail delivery group, which represents train operating companies, and talk through reform, talk through the money, and there's at least the basis for a conversation there. So, you know, what I've tried to do since I got this job was I met the unions, I've tried to change the tone of the conversation so that we're coming across as more reasonable, and I made sure that improved, reasonable offers were made to the trade unions on behalf of their workforce. And, you know, we've made some progress on Network Rail. The TSSA, their leader was one of those giving evidence at the Select Committee today, and Unite have settled with Network Rail, so we've made some progress.
The thing is, though, you know, you mentioned the TSSA there. I mean, what the RMT would say to that is that they didn't have the same issue when it comes to job losses and changes to their working conditions, so it was easier for them to strike a deal.
Well, look, these are the sorts of things that have to be thrashed out. But, you know, part of the offer that have been made is partly on pay, partly on conditions, but also there have been some guarantees now about no compulsory redundancies for a period. But it's for the unions now to talk to the employers and thrash out the detail. And I accept those details are important, but they've now got the space to do that.
I get that you're trying to change the tone to come across as reasonable, as non-confrontational, but just a couple of things to pick up on in what you're saying. You say you want the unions to be neutral. Do you think that they are not being neutral then?
No. All I meant was this technical term. It's just the RMT, when they put the first deal to their members, they recommended their members reject it. So all we're trying to get to, we're realistic to think they probably won't go as far as necessarily recommending it, but we at least want them to put it to their members and say, look, here's a deal. You decide what to do. We're not going to tell you what to do, and let their members make a decision based on all the facts.
At the beginning, you said that you thought Mick Whelan had been unfair in putting the chances of a deal at zero. Do you frankly think that some of the union leaders are acting in good faith? Are they playing to the cameras a bit, do you think?
No, look, I think it's not helpful if either they or I personalise it. I want to focus on the substance. And the reason why I said I thought he was being a bit unfair was just because things have moved on. You know, an offer has now been made. You know, so that he may not like the offer and he may want it to be more or whatever, but an offer has been made. So we have made some progress. There's something now for his union to debate and talk about with the train operating companies. So I think we need to make some progress.
I asked you the question about good faith because it feels to me like the union leaders are saying that you are not acting in good faith. I just want to have a look at what Mick Lynch at the RMT said at the committee today. He suggested you deliberately let the strikes go ahead over Christmas. He said they let the strikes go ahead over Christmas. They didn't lift the telephone or lift a finger to get them off. He's implying, isn't he, that you deliberately let the strikes go ahead over Christmas to try and turn public opinion against industrial action?
No, not at all. Look, I was very clear, because I was interviewed by a number of media organisations before Christmas, and I was very clear. I'd facilitated offers to go to the trade unions. I wanted them to sit down with the employers, talk through those details, look at the reform package and try and get to a solution and not have the strikes. Those strikes were not just damaging for, the workers that lost income, but they were enormously inconvenient for, not just for people going to work and important appointments, but the hospitality sector, for example, reckon that it cost them about £2.5 billion in lost revenue. So if I could have avoided the strikes happening, I would have done, if I could have done some more to do that, I would have done so. But I did what I could do, which is to make sure that we had some offers on the table for the unions and the employers to talk about them. And I'm pleased that that's what they're now doing. And I hope that we can make some progress.
There's another thing that I struggle to get my head around, frankly. Right. Is it right that the Department for Transport still pays out money to the train operating companies during strike action? So even if there's no service, they still get money from the taxpayer?
Well, look, the way it works post-COVID is that effectively, we don't have the franchising model anymore. We have a system where the railway companies are paid, by my department to operate the service that exists.
Because the question is, if that is the case, then they haven't really got any incentive to reach a deal, have they? They're going to get their money, whatever happens. It doesn't matter to them if there's strikes or not.
Well, they get paid to run the service, but they do want to solve these problems, and ultimately I want to solve these problems because, your viewers may not realise this, but, since COVID, the taxpayer has put a fortune into the railways.
That's my point. The taxpayer is still putting fortune into the railways, even if there's no trains.
Yes, no, absolutely, and it's
why don't you stop that?
But it's one of the reasons, though, why we need to settle these disputes. But we have to settle them in a way that's fair, both to the passenger, who is interested in how much their fares are and whether their trains are reliable, but also the taxpayer. There isn't a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money.
I'm keen to talk to you a bit about the NHS as well, because obviously the transport is not the only sector where strikes are going ahead. We've seen lots of strikes in the NHS as well, nurses, ambulance workers as well. We'll be talking to Pat Cullen of the Royal College of Nursing after this interview. What's your message to her?
Well, look, I think two things, I think. First of all, in the NHS, we have a way of dealing with pay, which is through these independent pay review bodies. The government sets out its position, the unions are able to put evidence to them, and last year's pay review body, we accepted in full so that you've got nurses have got at least a £1,400 pay rise.
We play this game. We play this game for months now. You can overrule them if you want to, can't you?
Yeah, but we have a process on purpose so that it isn't just about politics. So we've accepted those pay review bodies, and by the way, not every government in the past has always accepted them. We've accepted those.
Yeah, that's the point. Not every government has always accepted them, so you don't have to.
They've tended to do less, not more. What we've done this week, which we thought was a helpful piece of transparency and discussion with the unions, was the pay review body, the Secretaries of State have got pay review bodies, wrote to the union leaders, met them to talk about the evidence that the government's going to put into those pay review bodies, to talk to the unions, to understand where there may be some common ground, and to look at what the pay review bodies are going to be doing for the coming financial year, and we thought that was helpful. But ultimately, the initial ask of the nursing union was a pay rise of RPI plus 5%. That was close on 19%.
They rode back on that.
Yeah, but coming up with a very large number and then saying you'll meet someone halfway for something that's still an inflation-busting pay rise, it isn't affordable for the taxpayer.
Well, they're saying that around 10%, which is around inflation.
Yeah, but it's not affordable for the taxpayer.
But it's not inflation-busting, is it?
It's way more, by the way, than is the average in the private sector, which is more in the 4 or 5% space. So, we've got to be fair to public service workers. We value nurses, which is why we gave them a pay rise when there was a freeze in the public sector. But it's also got to be fair for the people that are paying their taxes in the private sector who are getting much smaller rises.
I have to ask you, we're seeing multiple strikes across different sectors. Almost every week there's a new strike. This is a government or a prime minister that is trying to model itself as, is all about competence.
Yep.
And if you can't get a grip on these strikes, you're failing to avert them. Isn't that the definition of incompetence?
No, not at all. Look, what we're trying to do, and the Prime Minister set out his priorities last week, is about trying to halve inflation this year. Now, that doesn't happen magically by itself. It happens if you take sensible policy decisions. So, look, the reason why there are more strikes is very straightforward. Inflation has been high, not entirely, but largely driven by Putin's war in Ukraine, which has driven up energy prices and food prices. That's had a knock-on effect. So I completely understand why people are feeling under pressure. But the problem is if the government then just embeds those higher pay rises in the system, we're not going to halve inflation this year. And if we're still here next year with high inflation, we haven't helped anybody.
If people are struggling to heat their family. If people are struggling to heat their homes, feed their families, you hear stories about nurses going to food banks. They're not going to be thinking about embedding, pay rises.
Well, look, that's why we wanted to make fair pay rises, which is why we've accepted in full the pay review body recommendations. We've done that. That's also why that we've got a package of support for people to help them with high energy prices. So we accept that people need help, but you've got to balance it. And ultimately, we want to get to the position where we've halved inflation, we've driven it down, growing the economy, and then people will actually be and feel better off. And I think that's where we want to get to at the end of this year.
Just finally, because we are out of time, Rishi Sunak confirmed that he has used private healthcare in the past. He won't give us a time period, so we don't know if it was 10 years ago or 10 days ago. Should we care?
Well, I think the most important thing is whether he's doing the right thing for the NHS. And you know he comes from an NHS family. His dad was a GP, his mum was a pharmacist. And I judge him by what he does. And he's put... in the autumn statement, when we had tough decisions to take, we put a significant amount of extra resources into health and social care to deliver on the ground.
I guess that's maybe where some people's concern is, though. Will he do the right thing by the NHS if, we've seen these huge waiting times for ambulances, for A&E, for operations, for GP appointments? People may not trust that he's going to do the right thing if he doesn't understand what it's like for most people.
Well, look, I think he does, and that's why if you look at his priorities he set out last week, one of them was about those waits for elective operations, the operations that are planned, which is why we've almost got rid of anybody who's waiting for 2 years in that post-pandemic backlog. We're hoping to get that down to... By March, we'll have got rid of anybody waiting more than 18 months, and then the plan is by next spring we'll have got rid of anybody having to wait for more than a year. But at the same time, we're putting more resources in place to deal with accident and emergency, to get people out of hospital who don't need to be there, into social care. That's why the Secretary of State set out £500 million, another £250 million announced this week. So I think you judge the government by what it's doing. We're focusing on accident and emergency, we're focusing on elective recovery post-pandemic, and I think that's how the Prime Minister will be judged. And he set those priorities out clearly in his speech last week.
OK, thank you very much.
Pleasure.